I remember many years ago, around about the time of Big Bang, it's one for the teenagers, to get us started. We were working on a project at the London Stock Exchange. And as part of that, we had to build a data model, so it doesn't matter what, to computerise some element of the equities market. I mean, this is a market that's been running for sort of 300 years, and everybody knew what was going on. But when you sat down to draw up the data model, you realised nobody actually completely understood what was going on, and the whole thing rapidly became so complex, it was useless, and it made me sort of realise that it's not until you come to digitise something that you have to sort of really understand it. It's not until you've actually got to write a piece of computer code, you know what I mean? Like, it's all very well having sort of laws, but if you try to write those into C++, is that what the kids use nowadays? It was Coral 66 in my day. But when you come to write them into computer code, it doesn't really work. And it means you have to sort of rethink some things. And then you begin to realise, well, actually, we shouldn't be digitising something by making an electronic analogue of it. We should be creating something new that works better in the digital space. And that's what I sort of think about money. I mean, I'm sure you're going to disagree about this in the question and answer session. And so I know that sounds a bit weaselly, but it means when you say, what is money? I'm like, does it really matter? Right? Until you can show me it as a subroutine. I used to say that as a joke, by the way, until the Ethereum guys turned up with that T-shirt on how to create your own currency, 5 lines of code. Because I can't really use that one anymore. So what I thought I'd do is, in order to present a range of views, I have some of my own ideas about this, but I thought it would be more interesting for you to just go through quickly a range of a few different ideas from people who all know far more about this than me. And then I'll explain to you why I think, or as I go through, I'll explain why I think some of them are right, which picks out a particular direction, which hopefully will take us into the wider conversation with Vinay afterwards. And there's lots of different ways to approach this. None of them is a rule of physics. So what I thought I would do is I found an article in a magazine from 1998. This is when the internet hasn't been around. It's 20 years ago. The internet hasn't been around for very long. And there was an article about the future of money, where they interviewed some quite senior and important people around the world. And so I thought I'd use that as the sort of starting point. You'll see why as we move on. So I'm just going to quickly take you through a few different views on this. Philip Davis, professor, I've got all the titles written down, so I won't. Philip Davis, Professor Emeritus of Applied Mathematics at Brown University. I mean, I'm only showing you the ones that support my arguments, obviously, if you want to. He talked about the psychological relationship between the possession of virtual money and the ownership of real property, and spoke about the law of unanticipated consequences. And I think that's true. He said money is such a complex nexus, it's quite a good way of describing it, a complex nexus that it's particularly vulnerable to that law of unintended consequences. And so, and the example that I often use when I'm talking through this with clients, because it's a London example, is to talk about the story of the tally sticks in the London market, and how you had, I mean, it's a very famous story around here about how you had the tally sticks, which started off as a means for tax collection, and they became a store of value, and then they were traded, and they became a means of exchange, and they were used for all sorts of things that you could never have imagined they were originally going to be used for. So I think that's one point to bear, is this law of unintended consequences. Paul Kocher, president of cryptography, in fact I think he still is the president of cryptography research, certainly one of the smartest crypto people in the world, observed that breaking a crypto system is far more difficult than robbing a physical bank, but potentially far more profitable. And I think that's an interesting reflection on it as well. So if we're going to have something, if we're going to make money electronically, that's actually quite a high stakes game, right? Because you're making something that is potentially far more secure, but if it goes wrong, we have very serious problems. This is going to feed into one of the points I'm going to make later on about why I think what everybody else thinks about the future of money is wrong. He also said that he thought, this is 1998, he said he thought the world's first multi-billion-dollar electronic heist would occur by 2010. And I am desperate to know whether that happened or not. Because how do we know? Like, you know what I mean? Like, no one's going to boast about how they got ripped off for billions of dollars by some hackers or something like that. Chris Gregory, Professor of Anthropology and Archaeology, Australian National University. I have a particular affection for anthropologists and social anthropologists when I'm thinking about big picture stuff around money, because I think their perspectives are wider. And I think for a technologist like me, if you want to fit technological change into a wider context, they're the right kind of people to listen to about this stuff. So I'll be quoting a couple of them. He said gold would remain as the sovereign form of money for as long as war between people remains a possibility, which I thought was quite a depressing comment, frankly. But it says something about the profound conservatism around money. You know, we hang on to money long after it's outlived its usefulness, and then it takes a sort of seismic shift for it to change. And the example I think about I'm thinking of London examples again. The example I think about in London again would be the Great Recoinage of 1696. You know, England had gone for 100 years without a circulating means of exchange. The Industrial Revolution had already started because nobody knew that there was an Industrial Revolution going on. The only coin in circulation was the silver penny. The silver pennies were clipped and mutilated to the point where essentially nobody would accept them. We were moving to a moneyed economy, but there was no money to pay wages. I mean, this is a terrible economic situation. And it took sort of 100 years to fix that problem. Although interestingly, the route they chose to fix that problem is unimaginable nowadays. What they did then, in the 1690s, the problem got so out of control that even people who didn't understand anything about economics, politicians, could see that the economy was being held back by this, that it was a plague. So what they did was they wrote to all of the smartest people in the country to ask them what to do. That's unimaginable nowadays. Like, there's a serious thing, so I know we'll ask some smart people, as opposed to whoever won Celebrity Big Brother or Russell Brand or something like that. This is a novel approach. Let's ask some smart people what to do. And actually they chose the smartest person quite possibly who's ever lived, but certainly the smartest Englishman, which was Sir Isaac Newton. They made him Master of the Mint, and he fixed the problem. And by the way, put Britain on a gold standard as well, in 1714. So at the beginning of the 1690s, if you'd have said, what's the future of money? Everybody would have said, oh, it's probably silver pennies, but slightly better than ones we've got now. And less than a generation later, we had the Bank of England circulating paper notes, the gold standard, and the Great Recoinage. And none of those would have been predicted at all. So we have a profound conservatism that makes us hold on to notions of money until you get that seismic slip when it all changes. And obviously I tend to think we're getting to that point shortly. Now another anthropologist I want to refer to is a guy called Jack Weatherford. Jack Weatherford wrote a very, very good book about the history of money, called The History of Money, professor of anthropology. And he said, if we take the long view of history, money was not necessary until very recently. Soon, though not in our lifetime, the money phase of history will pass, and money as we know it will become one of those quaint curiosities of the past. So Weatherford said, actually he also gave one of my other favourite quotes, panders to my prejudice. He says, cash has become the domain of poor people and poor nations, which is also true. Although if you read the FT today, you'll see the story in the FT today about how the circulating use of cash in the UK has gone up in order to foster tax avoidance on a grand scale. The Bank of England is actually printing £50 notes solely so that people can avoid cash. They have no legitimate use. No £50 notes are ever used in a legitimate transaction. They're solely to avoid tax, and I don't understand why they're not being prosecuted for this. You know, companies, there was that, I think it was a Tory minister who said people who paid their builders in cash should be prosecuted for tax avoidance, and everybody had a go at it. But he was right. One of the reasons why I'm taking it up the rear end this weekend, doing my HMRC form, like the rest of you, is because a quarter of the economy aren't paying any bloody taxes. We're turning into a kind of upmarket Greece. And no one complains about this, I don't get it. Obviously, you know, we have a big proportion of drugs and prostitution in our economy, according to the government's official figures, and you know, maybe prepaid cards aren't ready for that space. But anyway, Weatherford, who's a social anthropologist, said, actually, if you look at the big picture, this money phase is actually quite limited. And he said the electronic world of the future looks much more like the Neolithic world economy before the invention of money. And what he meant by that was in what he's talking about, in the Neolithic world, you're talking about essentially a clan structure. And everybody inside the clan knows the wants and the future desires of everybody else inside the clan. And they have a 100% fail-proof trust and relationship management system. It's the clan, everyone knows everybody else, right? So if you want me to, I don't even know what they did in clans, if you want me to skin your buffalo or something, and in return I want you to help me build an extension on my house, we don't need the intermediary of money to make that work, because everybody can remember who owes everybody what inside that clan. And his point, of course, is in the future, because of, you know, Facebook and Twitter and social networks and computations across the social graph, we're all essentially living inside a clan again. It's just a much bigger one. But everybody will know everybody else's wants and desires, and you'll have a perfect trust relationship mechanism. So you won't need the intermediary of money in the same way. Paul Krugman said, actually I wasn't sure whether to leave this in, because, especially now they're filming it, because I don't know if disagreeing with a Nobel Prize winning economist on a subject he knows approximately 1,000 times as much about as I do is the best way to kind of advance an argument. But we'll give it a shot. So Paul Krugman said a few things about it. Paul Krugman said, there'll be a distinction between electronic cash and electronic money because of the need for small transactions where neither the buyer nor the seller want the buyer's creditworthiness to be an issue. I used to think that was true. So this was round about the time I was working on Mondex. And I used to think that idea was true, that actually you needed a separate system for managing small transactions where you could do everything offline, you wouldn't need to do credit checking or whatever. But in fact, I think the advances in technology, the impending Internet of Things, the fact that we have universal connectivity, has taken all of that away. So the distinction between cash and money, in my opinion, is actually just evaporating. Everything's just money. So I disagree with that. He said there will not be a universal currency for a long time. There is a big advantage to separating currencies providing price stability. I agree with him about that. I don't think there'll be a universal currency ever. I think it's a bizarre, in fact it doesn't work for Europe. You know, the idea that Germany and Greece can be in the same currency zone is plainly ridiculous. Why the Earth and Pluto could be in the same currency zone, I have absolutely no idea. And come to that, why London and Middlesbrough are in the same currency zone. It's absolutely baffling to me. If we want to save sterling, we've got to get London out of the sterling zone as soon as we possibly can. London is absolutely distorting the economy. Anyway, that's a separate subject. Krugman said corporations will not issue their own private currency. And his reason for saying that was that corporations don't last long enough to provide a reliable store of value. So in other words, if I'm saving for my pension, I want something that's going to be worth something in 50 years' time or 100 years' time. And most corporations just don't last long enough to make that viable. But that doesn't mean you couldn't imagine traded instruments which are claims that could be inherited or moved onwards. So, I mean, I agree with his basic point there, but, and we'll get back to this with Vinay's conversation, I'm sure. But actually, I suspect that the idea of private assets being used is probably stronger than Krugman was giving it credit for at the time. But the thing I disagree with him most about is Krugman said everyone wants an anonymous, reliable means of exchange. And I think that is simply not true. I gave a TEDx talk in Woking on Friday. And I wound people up a little bit there. So I said, well, look, imagine, I mean, let's use Bitcoin as an example, because that's what I'm going to talk about. Let's pretend for a moment that Bitcoin is anonymous. It isn't really. Let's pretend for a moment that everyone's going to use it. They're not. But let's just imagine what that would be like. And I said, if you want to know what a world that is based wholly on untraceable electronic money looks like, it's Somalia. If you want to live in a world where everything is based on cash, where nothing is traceable, no one's held accountable, where the rich can do whatever they like by mere possession of the money, well, I know what that looks like already. That's a world of warlords, and I don't really want to live in it. The idea that people want anonymous money is stupid, and it's also stupid asking people about a lot of things. It's stupid asking people about that, because they haven't really thought it through. So if you go down the street and say to people, oh, you know, should you have anonymous money, whatever, they'll say yes, because they haven't really thought about it. Don't listen to them. It's insane. The idea that we want to build anonymous money is absolutely crazy. You could persuade me that we want private money, but that's something different. Private money is a very different thing from anonymous money. And the cryptographers are easily capable of building money. Remember Stefan Brands and the work he did all those years ago? The cryptographers are perfectly capable of building money systems which preserve privacy as long as you behave, but if you misbehave, reveal your identity. And that's too complicated for anybody in Parliament to understand. Well, I think one of them's a scientist, isn't he? 1 out of 650 MPs is a scientist. But the truth is, that's what we should be aiming for. Robert Sapolsky, isn't it a couple more of these? Robert Sapolsky, the professor of neuroscience at Stanford University. The perfection of the identification system will guarantee urban myths about people bankrupted and some tech stole their pheromone signature. But he's building to that same argument as Weatherford about the Neolithic clan, which is if you know who all of the, I mean, let's set aside how, I mean, spheres there. But if you know who all of the counterparties to a transaction are, then actually sorting out payments is really easy. And whether you decide to do that through an intermediary of money, or whether you do it by arranging some other mutual cross-obligation of future claims, actually is not such a big deal. I mean, it's a big deal if you have a monetary policy and you're trying to control money. If you're trying to run the economy, it isn't such a big deal. And in actual fact, I think there are arguments which say, certainly made by economists, that actually you might have more flexibility in some ways with a system like this, monetary policy being quite a plump instrument. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about what technologists were talking about. Marvin Minsky, famous professor of computer science at MIT, he said, now remember, this is 20 years ago, this is long before the blockchain, long before Satoshi Nakamoto. He might well be Satoshi Nakamoto. Although, as we all know, Satoshi Nakamoto was on board the Malaysian airline plane that went missing everywhere. With fast computers and huge memories, we could have a non-linear database that would better understand what each person has and wants. That's your Neolithic clan again. Then, by using complicated game theory computations, it might turn out that everyone could get more in terms of their personal values for the goods they are willing to sell. Now, that return to this sort of weird Stone Age turbo barter sounds crazy when you first think about it. When you think about it in a world of blockchains and instant computation around the world, it's not so stupid. So like if you try and imagine it practically, I go and get on the bus, and somewhere out on the blockchain, the bus company has to find something that it wants, and I have to find something that somebody has got that the bus company... It makes no sense in the physical world. But virtually, you can imagine computations across the social graph taking place in nanoseconds that can resolve that, and those claims would all be settled instantly. And he wrote that 20 years ago. He also said, which goes back to the rest, he also said taxes will be, he believes in the goodness of mankind as I do. So Minsky also said, because of this, taxes would be lower because of the vast amount of uncollected tax today. And I genuinely do believe that the government would use that tax revenue to lower taxes, and they wouldn't just waste it on stupid things. I mean, why anyone would think that, I have no idea. But he also said, and remember, he's a technologist, he also said the system of electronic currency will never be acceptable unless the laws protecting privacy are greatly strengthened. So you see what's going on here. So you have people from the technical side saying, you know what, actually the future money possibly goes away when everybody knows everybody else. And this guy's saying, that's absolutely right, but you know, privacy, getting rid of cash mustn't mean getting rid of privacy. And I subscribe to this view completely. So knowing who everybody is in a transaction, I mean knowing in the transactional sense. I don't mean a full disclosure of everybody's identity at all stages. That's a different thing, right? We were talking about the example before we walked in here. There's a world of difference between proving you're 18 to a pub to get a drink and telling the pub your name and address and where you live and all this sort of stuff. They're completely different things. Now, I think if we take that privacy point on board, I think that gives us a little kind of inkling into where we're going. So I'm going to say, I'm going to frame my part of the discussion in this way. Weatherford was talking about Neolithic clans. Now, obviously, the clans we're moving into aren't going to be that same kind of thing. So let's use the word communities instead. So we're all going to belong to multiple communities. Some of them geographic, but most of them not geographic. Most of them they're going to be self-defined. It's going to be identities that we choose to enter into different groups. And within those communities, there'll be no need for money, because mutual cross-obligations within the community will serve instead of money. You might still need a kind of money in order to move between those communities. And that sort of seems reasonable to me. So of course, you'll argue that those currencies that you need will become sort of reserve currencies, and that might or might not be true. You have to think that through a little bit more. Think that through a little bit more. But in answer to the question, sorry, that took away my big finish. Oh, sorry, I'm going to have to back up a sentence, otherwise it spoils my big finish. Right. So within those communities, we operate without money, and we use something else instead. So that gives me my big finish. What is money? Trust. Okay, thanks very much.
Conferences or Bitcoin events, and have a dreadful tendency of leaving the audience horrified, dismayed, and confused. So we could either kind of go all the way down into the really kind of esoteric, far out stuff, or we could be relatively conservative, take it small. Can I have a kind of rough show of hands? Who wants the crazy version?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Crazy version. You want the crazy version? Right. Who wants something that they could potentially work on the next 5 years? Yeah. 1 or 2. Okay. So I want to start by talking about the nature of grey areas. Right. I did a bit of reading around to see what people were saying about what money was before I came this evening, and I saw a remarkable argument made from somebody not so far from here that law defined money. And I think that this is a very strong, very practical argument, in as much as law defines lots of institutions like marriage or taxation or a whole bunch of other things. But actually, the zone of things that law defines and the zone of things that actually happen are disjuncted sets. Right? There's a huge amount of stuff which happens that is either not legal or, even more interestingly, neither legal nor illegal because nobody's ever thought about it. And there's an enormous amount of stuff that happens which is blatantly illegal and goes on for years because nobody cares about enforcement. So, in a sense, until a specific situation goes all the way up the court system and all the way back down the other side, with an actual ruling and a decision and enforcement and all the rest of that stuff, the whole thing exists in this kind of, jelly-ish grey area. It just kind of has this long, flexible thing attached to it. So if we start the question of what is money, with this notion that we have a nice, clean, crisp, accurate definition that we can then use to reason about what's happening in the environment, we're always going to automatically be inside of a kind of government box legalism that gives you nice, clean, precise answers that have nothing at all to do with the real world. Right? Or we could take the other approach and we can say, right, well, what money is defined by common practice, and there are a set of behaviours that we expect to see more of or less of that generate things like common law marriage or common law money. Right? Well, over here they seem to be doing a whole bunch of trade in cigarettes and taxi tokens. Over here the currency appears to be phone minutes. Is that money? It's kind of sort of money. It's a lot like money. It's money with demurrage. It seems to expire. It's issued by a corporation. It'll be replaced by something else in 2 years. So once you get into this notion that there are crisp, concrete, real things which age relatively well, they're fairly protected, they've got durability like the state. And on the other side, you have this kind of ephemeral zone of cultural transformation where things kind of come in and out of focus. It becomes a lot easier to ask questions like, what is money? Because the real answer is, how far along this curve towards absolute solidity has a given kind of transaction or commerce gone? Right? What we're looking at here is essentially an adoption curve with private practice among small groups at one end, all the way right up this ramp until the thing is not only established nationally but enshrined in international treaties. Does this kind of make sense as an initial frame? Right? So it's not necessary at any one point to have this nice, sharp, black and white cutoff now it is money, now it is not money. It's actually a series of decisions made by a bunch of different actors and different entities about whether something is money enough for them to regulate or adjudicate over or even accept. Has anybody in this room heard of e-gold? Okay, a couple of hands. Right. So I was a heavy user of a digital currency that ran from about the mid-90s to about 2005, 2006, called e-gold. And e-gold, at the height of its power, was about $80 million worth of gold sitting in vaults in Dubai and Canada, I think. And it was tradable as an account-based currency with all the transactions being done in database. You know, I think I seem to remember I was getting paid about 5 ounces of gold a month, because at the time the gold price was pretty low and I was doing quite well. And you could either take that out as physical coins, or you could have them out change it by sending wire transfers places. And a community of people grew up around that treated gold as money because it acquired a lot of fungibility. But the e-gold company kept going back to the federal government and asking for a banking license, because as far as they were concerned, they were simply a bank that operated gold. Please regulate us, please regulate right here. And eventually in 2005, the federal government decided that it would be much easier to arrest them all than to regulate them. And they were finally done. I seem to remember the exact charge was banking without a license. So this is a classic example of something that had widespread community adoption, that theoretically one administrative decision would drag that over the hump, and it would have become a nice, clean, standard part of the financial system. But somewhere in there, a regulator looked at it and was like, ah, this is not for us, this is not for us, this is not for us, kill it with fire. And that reaction, I see all of that same psychology playing out around blockchain technology. Right? You know, what is it? We don't know. Is it money? Well, it depends who you ask. What should we do about that? I don't know. Should we regulate it? Do we understand it well enough to decide whether we can kill it or not? Why don't we ignore it, and then later on, in a rash panic, we can do something drastic? And that is the standard approach, right? That is just how business is done relative to state regulation. So, this kind of teeter-totter of gradual acceptance followed by radical snapback is a fundamental cultural trait, right? If you look at the negotiations around, say, euthanasia, right, that's going through all of the same kind of creeping acceptance, dramatic backlash stuff that you see around Bitcoin, that you used to see around e-gold. Any area where society is not really sure what something is has a lot of kind of slow creeping progress and gradual acceptance, followed by episodes of irrational panic. And if it dies in one of the irrational panic, it's gone for somewhere between a generation and a century. Right? Things kind of creep in until eventually you've got a generation that has grown up with them, kind of overhears a thing that people do, and that generation assumes that this stuff is normal and normative, and after that it becomes orthodoxy. And that process, I don't think ever really happens faster than generation. Right? This, I think, is the key piece of analysis that a lot of the Bitcoin guys are missing, is that until you've got a generation that have grown up using Bitcoin in high school to buy and sell, I don't know, whatever it happens to be, baseball cards, they're really never going to feel like this stuff is money, because technology is anything that was invented after you turned 40. Right? Everything up until that point is just reality. And then you begin to get this thing with this stuff that begins to feel like technology. You know, I mean, I'm perfectly comfortable with parallel computers and quantum cryptography and all the rest of that. It's all just fine. You begin to talk to me about this, nasty, scary, wet biological stuff where we're talking about 20 years of life expansion by, injecting people with goo, which will, stick bits back on the end of their telomeres. And that begins to feel like technology. That really is a little intimidating. So, everybody got a nice, clear sense of this curve, right? And social push, forward, backlash, forward, backlash, forward, backlash. Now, who is comfortable that they understand blockchains reasonably well? Okay, show of hands. Anybody going to come up here and explain them to the audience? Brave. So, I'm strongly of the opinion that the blockchain thing is best understood as being a kind of administrative upgrade to the good old-fashioned SQL database, right? It's a spreadsheet, right? The problem with SQL databases was always that you wound up with this enormous, vicious priesthood that sat on top of them to protect them from people like you. And the blockchain guys kind of eventually come up with a database which is so aggressive that it doesn't need any database administrators to protect it. It's like the Tyrannosaurus Rex of databases. Right? You need enormous warehouses filled with burning machinery that basically just sit there and act as computational radiators. But at the end of that, you get a database that everybody can write to, nobody can edit, nobody can hack, and the bloody thing is as permanent as the social construct that pays for it. And then any monkey can write a bunch of scripts which read and write stuff from that database, and this we call the blockchain economy. Right? When you put it in those kind of terms, it becomes fairly obvious that it would be, foolish and naive to regulate away a technology like this. Well, what is it? It's a database. Well, it's a really resilient database. Fantastic. What are people doing with this really resilient database? Massive amounts of money laundering and organised crime. Oh, we're against that. Well, you were against that before they had a database, right? So this notion, right, that you have a relatively confined breakthrough in computer science that happens to have a bunch of software written against it by a bunch of people that are basically anti-state libertarian weirdos, and that the result is that this piece of computer science technology becomes irrevocably welded to a set of politics that most people find kind of abhorrent. You know the phrase, you can have anonymous digital cash or a welfare state, pick one. Right? Most people, if they understood the dialogue in those terms, they would go for it. And this also gets into the Scandinavian digital currency, where they're attempting to figure out how you build taxation right into the heart of the digital currency systems, so that you could potentially have a perfectly stable nanny state. Interesting. So, to kind of round this off, we have this very interesting technology that gives us a good, clean, kind of velociraptor database, right? It's a database that can take care of itself, feral database. And then around that, people build applications that have a very different structure because the feral database doesn't require a priesthood and, kind of three-phase power to maintain it. And what you see is this leakage of technology and power out of the institutions that have the technical infrastructure and the staff to maintain this kind of structure into the hands of people that had previously had no access at all to resilient computation. And I think this is the frame of analysis. Right? Once you have a resilient computation layer out there, anybody can pile stuff on top of that, and the stuff that gets piled on top of that is the stuff that you can't build anywhere else. Right? And this is where you then get started down the path. Right? A technology that is genuinely durable in the face of resistance and censorship is always going to be used for things that other cheaper, better technologies that are vulnerable can't be used for. Right? If only outlaws really have enough spare cash to bother spending it on blockchains, only outlaws will have blockchains. But who those outlaws are varies depending on where we are up this curve. Right? If Wall Street really gets on top of Bitcoin, the government regulates it, and they start basically KYCing new Bitcoin accounts, unless you've got a nice clean federal certificate on your key, we're not going to believe that your cash is still there. Not hard to do technically, right? That's a process whereby that particular thing now has the full status of money because it has been blessed by that most conservative of authorities, right? Whereas if that doesn't happen and it gets pushed back down, you wind up with this kind of permanent, stable Bitcoin-powered utopia because it's been adopted so far in, and then it kind of got the big no rather than the big yes. Right? Welcome to society, here are your handcuffs, or very sorry, you're not coming in, get back over there into your cave. Now, does this all kind of make sense as a frame? Right. I did promise you some farmers. So, right now, we exist in a profoundly unfair world, right? We all know this kind of power law wealth distribution thing. What was it, on the order of 150 people with about as much wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion? So if we disenfranchise about 3,000 people, everybody in the world could double their wealth apart from those 3,000 people. Wow. Right. Clearly, that's only 3,000 people. They could each have a small private island, right? And we could double the amount of wealth that the average person had access to. It's not that unlikely that when you have a world with that kind of wealth inequality, and you get this kind of extremely durable computational technology in widespread adoption, particularly in places where you can't run regular services, that you're going to get political change on the back of the ability to have uncensorable free speech. And if you think about the amount of trouble and the sheer volume of mass murder that was caused by Marxism, on the order of 250 million served, it really begins to worry me, because how long do we have before the combination of enormous poverty, poor outnumbers roughly 10 to 1, plus resilient computation, results in the necessary preconditions for a very, very, very sudden shift in the global equilibrium, right? As the radical edge, the people that are currently largely excluded from the reindeer games, finally figure out how to break down the doors, at which point it doesn't really matter what the Western states say yes or no to about common practice and whether things are legal or not, because they're not really going to be doing anything other than putting out fires at their own borders. These technologies don't exist in a static political vacuum. Right? We only vote roughly as often as we did at the very beginning of English democracy. Right? I mean, 4-year electoral terms have been around for, what, something like 250, 300 years? Right? So everything else in society is accelerated by a factor of 50, 100. Voting is still happening at the same pace it did 300 years ago. As a result, it's become increasingly irrelevant. So this whole notion that resilient computation is just about some kind of, boxy little digital currencies that a bunch of libertarians are running around trying to present as the messiah, this is kind of ridiculous, right? There just isn't enough of a gradient there for very much to really happen. Real gradients are massive pre-existing structural poverty in the world, which is left over from colonialism. And on the other side of that, you have populations that are going to get their first smartphones and their first access to resilient computation platforms in the same generation. And I think the question for us, whether it's money or whether it's not money, it doesn't really matter, right? What matters is whether it's power. And if it is power, because it's free software, it's the kind of power that anybody can have, regardless of how little money they've got. The possibility is that what we're going to encounter is super empowered poor people who outnumber us 10 to 1, renegotiating the global balance of everything. In a time when the climate is breaking, life extension is becoming practical, virtual reality is everywhere, and robotics are beginning to get to the point where they're good enough to scare you. All simultaneously inside of the next decade. Does this sound like it's going to be fun? Right? I mean, as members of a largely very conservative industry, if I was you right now, I would be absolutely terrified. But it's not Bitcoin guys. I mean, they can be co-opted extremely easily. It's the fact that the entire global structure that led to these concentrations of wealth in the first place is under enormous pressure from the bottom up as they get their cell phones. And this negotiation between those with capital and those without even income, I think is going to be the defining moment of the internet as we go from a largely white privileged internet to a largely poor and brown internet. And the negotiation that we're going to have over these electronic platforms about the nature of the global system is really where the pain points are going to be. It's not about finance, it's about identity, it's about access to education, it's about censorship. Danish cartoonists or French cartoonists being assassinated by Muslims who've imported their values and their guns, at the same time as we're sending out flying over death squads who are killing in their own countries. Right? All of that stuff is just a precursor of what happens when you wind up with 4 billion poor people, resilient computation, and cell phones. So, there.
So, thank you, gentlemen. Yes, if you would like to join up here, would like to facilitate a Q&A, that would be fantastic. Really appreciate it, guys. Get them all out.
Yeah. If we're cutting our heads off, just.
Thank you, guys. Okay. That was brilliant. Thank you. I'll do my best to try and facilitate questions. Yeah, and get thoughts from the audience. But before I do that, because I'm the guy that's standing up and speaking, I'm going to be really cheeky and ask a question myself and hopefully get the ball rolling. So, somebody recently described Bitcoin to me as being like digital gold. except it's gold that can teleport. Because I can move it anywhere in the world, near instantly, and it still has the value that the market perceived it had when it moved, initially when it disappeared. So, Dave, you made a point, I think, in your conversation that you said there might need to be these sorts of reserve currencies or ways of translating between different types of value and data. Can you see, Vinay and Dave, Bitcoin playing a role in that, or something like Bitcoin playing a role in that? Is there value in that, perhaps?
Oh, thanks very much. Well, I mean, I agree quite strongly with Vinay that the real revolution is the blockchain, not Bitcoin. And I think that was considered, you know, an unusual view a couple of years ago. But I'd say that's probably mainstream opinion now. So I'm much more interested in the blockchain than I am about Bitcoin. It's interesting. The idea that currencies will be based purely on the cryptography, I'm unconvinced of that. So I think these currencies are much more likely to be related to. See, if they're rooted in communities, they're going to be based on something to do with community values, or they're going to be something to do with. I mean, corporations don't last forever, but people will always need energy, or people will always need calories, or something. I mean, I don't know, but I think they're more likely to be something like
value.
You know, Bitcoin. I don't want to be mean, but you know, Bitcoin is a way of keeping score in a mining network. You know, and it has a valuable role for doing that. But it's quite a jump to turn it into a currency from that. And you know, I mean, other people have different views, and I'm perfectly prepared to listen to them. But it doesn't grab me that way.
Yeah. If pretty much every web developer in the world accepted Bitcoin, then the rate of exchange would be kind of backed by professional services. If you're redeemable for something that was legally legitimate, it would be an actual global market. It would have a kind of well-established value. The fact that there are basically very few places to actually use Bitcoin that establish its value against services rather than goods, I think is one of the reasons that it's got such volatility. So it's easy for me to imagine, you know, if the Bitcoin guys get their stuff together and wind up with professional services as the fundamental backing, I don't see any reason why Bitcoin shouldn't become quite stable. But if you're not going to back it by the function of an actual economy, then at that point you mustn't have the same kind of protection that you've got for, say, the dollar. Right? You know, here's America, it's shares in America, don't ask questions, it's all fine. Right? Dollar. And that's workable, right? Yeah. You point to the Bitcoin economy, show me the transactions which are only possible because Bitcoin exists. There just aren't the transactions. So, you know, the lack of international trade in Bitcoin for I think professional services are key. You know, I think is a restriction, right? If they had that service. On the other hand, you know, Bernard Later wrote a book called Future Lab.
That's right.
Yeah. So he was the guy that designed.
Come to our forum while you spoke there a few years ago.
So he was the guy that designed the convergence mechanism for the euro. Belgian central banker, pretty much the guy that invented the concept of complementary currency as a description of existing practice. So he didn't invent it, but he came up with the terminology to describe it. Later is currently tracing a thing called the Terra. And the Terra is the idea of doing a global reserve currency that is backed by natural resources, largely ecosystem service generating resources. So here's the sustainable harvest of the ocean, here's the oxygen regenerating capacity of rainforests, here is the future food production of this sort of set of topsoil, and we're going to use these things as backing for reserve currencies. So if poor nations begin to fell their forests for cash, their currency deflates.
Yeah.
And you know, I mean, much as the euro is a mixed bag, it's there and it's going to be around for a really long time. Probably. It's got at least as good a chance of surviving as the dollar. Imagine if blockchain technology plus Terra, and you kind of put a loop around that. And go, well, you know, maybe so. But without backing, you know, it's either going to have to be backing by use, or it's going to have to be backing by asset it's not either one of these things, how's it going to do? I don't know.
Questions? Anyone? Question? Yes.
David, you ended your piece by saying, what is money? Money is trust. And you started off by comparing skinning a buffalo to building an extension on a house, which I get is very rudimentary, but the question I would point to you is, do you think it's actually physically possible in a society from today moving forward to uneducate us on the value of money? For example, if you were to come to me and say, if you skin my buffalo, I need you to build an extension on my house, I would say absolutely not. Skinning a buffalo is nowhere near the comparison of building an extension on a house. So my question to you is, do you think it's actually possible, not even now, but in the future, to uneducate us of the value of time and money and effort? And
yeah, no, that's a very interesting question. I think you see some experiments which never really reach scale around time banks and this kind of thing. Complementary currencies which attempted to value people's time as equal, and they didn't really get any traction. So there's got to be some other way of resolving these claims. I mean, no one is pretending those things are equal. But the question is, see, the value of them might well be very, very different. But the question, but do you need money as an intermediary between them? So money in the sense of a unit of, money as a measure. I guess it's a limitation of the English language, because we're using the one word money to mean three completely different things. We're talking about money as the measure of a unit of account, money as the medium of exchange in transactions, and money as the store of value. So is it possible that money as the mechanism of exchange will go away, but money as the store of value, money as the measure will have to stay? Yes, that's you're going to have to measure things somehow. Although of course, in different communities they might have different approaches to that, and that kind of one of the things that attracts me to those anthropologists' vision of lots of different kinds of money, which are based in communities, is that sort of ecological argument of robustness. That if there's only one kind of money, we're all using one kind of money, and something goes wrong with it, then we're all screwed. But if there's lots of different kinds of money that lots of different communities are using, some of them might value things in very different ways to others, and that's fine for them. So I'm sorry, I can't offer a more precise answer, because I'm groping this out just like everybody else is. But there's something appealing to in my head about the sort of community-based argument.
Just for what it's worth, I have a client who has a technology for doing network barter. So it will identify complex ISO-valued trade lines among a set of possible transactions. And the only way to make it work, even though the money is changing hands, is to value everything with equivalent dollar value. So
yes, in fact, there was a study done for the City of London a couple of years ago that I contributed to. I've forgotten but it was about that. It was about, could the City of London be a focus for barter networks as it is for other kinds of financial networks? And I remember one of the things floating around there was London could potentially set a benchmark value standard. You'd have like the London mark or something, which would be the version used by these barter networks. I think it was going to be like a basket of commodities. I don't remember exactly.
But in practice, that dislocation of money as a measure from money as a commodity changing hands seems to be the way this stuff is actually working in the field. Right down here we become a long tail. That's the actual working practice.
Yeah.
So I think this notion that in practice you can see money as a measuring tool continue long after money itself is one of the set of exchanges, but not the only one.
Yeah, I think that's probably right.
It's plausible.
Sorry, just to reflect on the last question, I don't know if this is any kind of measure, but we're a consulting company, and people only pay us to do things that they're actually interested in. And by far, I mean, we have a number of different Bitcoin projects. By far, the biggest Bitcoin project that we work on has absolutely nothing to do with payments or money. You know, it's more to do with the sort of digital asset management that you were talking about.
Could you just take a stab at how you see? I mean, if this dislocation is to take place and it's going to move from where it is to where you're sort of suggesting it'll go, there's quite I guess there may be 2 or 3 scenarios as to how that might happen. I mean, either you get some form of catastrophe which we might get simply because of the way the current monetary system is being managed and handled, which means that there has to be a completely different approach. But whatever it is, it seems to me that there's going to be a challenge because it's relatively easy, but not that easy. I listen to you and I catch probably only about 20% of what it is that you're saying. But for the general public, and particularly for the custodians of society, to get their heads around all this and work out how any form of transition takes place, it's actually quite difficult to see how that will happen. So it could be traumatic because for some reason or another a major dislocation brings it about, or a major event happens, or it could be gradual and wise and careful stewardship that moves us from one to the other.
No, I understand your question. I mean, personally, I think it's more likely to come from this law of unintended consequences that I said at the beginning. I know my examples are very London-centric, but London has such a rich history of all of this kind of, and of course I'm very familiar with all these examples, but the way that the tally sticks went from being a Norman record of taxes to an element of government monetary policy. We didn't stop using them until 1829. I mean, it's again very conservative. The way they became the kind of store of value was unintended. The point about the Bank of England, I think, is that nobody was sitting around saying, if only we had paper notes that we could. That just wasn't what happened. The bank was founded for a completely different purpose. War against France, as it happened. So I'm not saying the money wasn't wasted. But you know what I mean? It was founded for a completely different purpose. And then it happened that the notes found traction amongst the merchant. I mean, remember, for a long time, the smallest Bank of England note was £5, which is an enormous sum of money. And yet, for merchants, it became more convenient to search, blah, blah, blah. So
the £50 note of today?
€500.
So I tend to go for that. I tend to think it's going to be something to do with that law of unintended consequences. And if you find something that... I also, and again, I can't prove any of this with a spreadsheet work, but I have a strong suspicion it's going to be something with energy as well. Because you see these nascent startups, I mean, I'm aware of quite a few, that are looking at the idea of energy-based currencies of one form, and that's because they want things that have long-term store of value, which goes back to the pension point, right? What do you want to put in your pension pot? Do you want to put pounds in there, which you have absolutely no idea what they'll be worth when you retire? Or do you want to put kilowatt hours in there, because you know that when you're retired, you're going to need a certain number of kilowatt hours?
Do you see this as being a kind of either or being the same kind of thing that we saw with credit cards coming in beside cash and not displacing it? Is it that you wind up with additional payment options, additional stores of value, or do you think some of the old stuff will die on the way?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think we had a fantastic FS Club debate up in Scotland last year before the referendum about whether Scotland should have its own currency. And the point is, because it was like, why don't you just use euros, or why do you have your own currency? Well, because it's an emblem, and I'm talking at Leicester next week with Nigel Dodd, who's just written this huge book called The Social Life of Money, which looks at all of these different angles. Because we're thinking of money because of our context tonight, purely in the sort of financial sense, but actually money has a lot of other dimensions. And in reality, to try and understand the changes, you have to understand these other dimensions, which I don't. And so there are social, psychological, national, other aspects to it as well. I suppose because I'm arguing for plurality, my guess is that a lot of them will be circulating at the same time. You know, if we go back a couple of hundred years, like when you were talking about this being that East End shopping mall a couple of hundred years ago, then nobody would have thought it at all odd that you were buying some things with Dutch guilders and German marks. But everybody knew the relative value of these things. It wasn't, you know, and of course we're in a smartphone age, so there might be hundreds of these currencies circulating, but you might not even know it because, you know, I'm going into the Tesco next door and buying something with my phone. And so it's up to my phone and Tesco's to sort out what money they get. I don't even really care. You know, I mean,
so it's
you
an
know,
interesting
the price in Tesco could be in some weird currency I've never heard of. But what my smartphone shows me is my preferred currency choice or whatever. You see what I mean? It's like so
I do.
much more
I mean, in fact, just one comment, and then I'll shut up. But it is an interesting thesis, isn't it? That if the management of money becomes so profligate, in other words, as money as we understand it today, and somehow or another people's confidence in it starts to disappear because it's been so heavily abused, that other surrogates that are coming into play, which are made possible by blockchain technology, suddenly start to become much more attractive. So if you take your energy example, if I suddenly think, actually, you know, they've been printing so much money over the last 20 years that we've lost track of really how much it's worth and what value it is and does it do any good anyway and all the rest of it. But actually the thing I am interested in is kilowatt hours. So can anybody give me something in kilowatt hours? Blockchain can give you that in kilowatt hours. That's where I'm going to go. And you suddenly get a multiplicity of I mean, that stretches society's structures massively, I think.
This is a question about value, right? I mean, this is the distinction of money relative to value.
Yeah.
So, you know, solar panels have dropped in price by 7% a year, every year for the past 40 years. They were this very long, very slow, very stable exponential curve. Right now, they are roughly at grid parity. About 10 years ago, I worked on a book called Smallest Profitable, which was one of the Economist's Book of the Year in 2003, really describing how you actually calculate the value of decentralized energy resources, because the standard power industry accounting practices just can't touch it. They have no way of understanding what happens in that kind of environment. So 10 years from now, if that trend continues or accelerates, which is more likely, silver will be half the price of grid power. 10 years after that, it'll be a quarter of the price of grid power. 10 years after that, it'll be an eighth of the price. You know, I mean, at some point you hit some kind of asymptotic physical limit. You also hit a point where nobody cares to make it any cheaper because it's just cheaper than it needs to be, and it winds up being priced like shoes, fashion. So when we start thinking about, you know, kilowatt currencies, the notion that your kilowatt currencies have debt margin simply by virtue of the fact that, you know, that they're deflating. Electronic equipment, you know, I mean, you go to any of the second-hand camera stores in London, and you see gear that was £1,000 5 years ago is now on sale for about 150 quid. Right? You know, old computers, same thing. And so we're in this position where we've got this enormous deflationary weirdness coming in technology. And I think in some ways, some of what we're scrambling for is that all of our money assumes that you're dealing with scarce resources that become scarcer, rather than abundant resources that become more abundant. And we don't actually have a logic of exchange when the fundamental assets that your society is based on are increasing in a predictable way on one side, and then you've got all this extremely scary environmental weirdness on the other. Like, the confusion about value and the durability of value, I think is really fundamental. And I don't even know who's got a hand on this. You know, most of the energy think tanks and the ecology think tanks have no clue about finance. Most of the people that are worrying about technological acceleration don't talk ecology or finance. You know, it's kind of ecology, finance, and technological acceleration under one roof hasn't actually happened yet. I think we desperately need it to steer us, because without that, anybody that's working on any one of those trends individually is going to get slapped on the head by the other two.
I think two things about it. I think, and I'm not sure which one I think is more probable, but I can see that if that's true, if you move into a world without scarcity, then money has two possible. So either you go into a Star Trek world where there is no scarcity and therefore no money. Nobody ever pays for anything in Star Trek because there is no money because there's no scarcity. Which to me seems there's always going to be a scarcity of something.
Restrictions.
Which, yeah.
They do exchange stuff in planets in Star Trek. It's only on board the ship that's not.
They do, sorry?
They do exchange stuff with planets. It's only on board the ship, isn't it? And that's a sealed unit. Like
It's a military ship.
It's a military ship. It's a military ship. Unit.
It's a pretty plush for a military ship.
I probably should have used an economics textbook rather than Star Trek.
I think it's better for our future.
But there's always going to be something that's scarce, and money can shift to that extent. Which actually links to your point about what you might call emerging market disruption.
Yeah.
Because if you use the blockchain, so for example, if you think in the London market, I mean, I'm not sure exactly, but I would have thought the biggest use of the blockchain in the London market, is probably going to be around digital assets, corporate paper, that kind of stuff, right? But if you go to somewhere in Africa, it's going to be around land or water or something like that, or in fact identity, and so those things will become monetized. Not in the sense that somebody make a profit, but they'll be used as a sort of monetary thing. So sure, people will profit. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think this is.
Otherwise, what's going to pay for the infrastructure? If we don't have, if you take people that we cannot.
Well, because you might want to create that infrastructure in order to generate economic activity that sits above it. If you see what I mean. So yes, I'm not saying anyone would do this out of goodness.
Like what we say to self is right. That the reason the self spread is because the ship business model. It was possible to capitalize building tankers. And I think that unless it's possible to capitalize this kind of system of transportation, they're just going to stall like engineers.
Sorry, I was going to make a silly example because the land thing was making. But I mean, like, if you're a Russian oligarch, right, you already put your money into London property. But right now you have to go to all of the hassle of actually buying the house, of hiring some servants to look at it. But I mean, if it was all the blockchain, I know this goes to my boring Internet of Things argument, I'm sure you've heard 100 times. But there's a line of conceptual thought which says the blockchain makes the virtual world more like the physical world, because in the physical world you can only have one of things, whereas in the virtual world you can have an infinite number of things. And on the blockchain you can only have one of them. So the blockchain makes the virtual world more like the physical world. So if my London land is on the blockchain, which makes it easier and cheaper to transact, then it will become money-like, in the sense it will be an asset that people would want to hold on the blockchain. And I'd much rather, if I'm a Russian oligarch, I'd much rather hold a coin that has the title over some land in London than a coin that has nothing, essentially. You see what I mean? So
This is all basically trusts.
that's an interesting way of putting it.
Yeah, it's just,
I don't know what the answer is, but I think unexpected consequences and plurality.
Good. Some people itching to ask questions back there. Yeah.
I mean, picking up on that, on your discussion about unintended consequences, maybe this is particularly for David, and bringing slightly back